Today we're going to talk about AI alignment. Is it even harder than we think? And this is the third AI-focused online salon at Foresight. In the previous 2 weeks, we discussed chapters in the recently published book on superintelligence, coordination and strategy, which a few people here on this call submitted chapters to. And then based on those previous salons, Daniel Schmachtenberger, who we had for another salon in the Hive Mind series, reached out to me and recommended today's speaker to me because he may bring an underappreciated perspective to the set of problems in AI alignment. And, as a disclaimer, Forrest Landry is from the Neurohacker Collective. Welcome, Forrest. And he's not an AI safety or AI alignment researcher, but I think that's exactly why he thinks that he may have an outsider's eye to contribute to the field, and he may be able to point to a few areas that are underexplored. So we'll kick off with a presentation by Forrest, who's outlining a list of reasons why AI alignment may be harder than we think, perhaps even impossible. And then we open up for a discussion with all of you. And we may start with our Foresight Fellows. For example, Creon Levitt, who's a Foresight Senior Fellow and physicist, who may be enticed to speak a little bit on a few physical claims that Forrest makes, as well as channeling Anders Sandberg, who is our Senior Fellow in philosophy, but who's currently on a flight and can't make it, but he says hi to you, Forrest, and he would have loved to make it. And he has an update on a paper that I think you were wanting to write, which we can come back later. But then maybe we'll also be joined by Dan Alton, our 2020 Fellow in AI, and by Jeff Laddish, our 2020 Fellow in Biosecurity, who may also feel enticed to kind of make a few comments to kick us off with a tricky but hopefully really fun discussion. Okay, so today will definitely be a little bit of an experiment, and I encourage all of you with relevant background to speak up. Wants to kind of red team Forrest's claim, but then also maybe to surface potential other problems in AI alignment that haven't been surfaced in the presentation that we ought to bring to the table in the discussion. Okay, that's enough for me. So let's have Forrest present his list of good reasons to be skeptical that AI alignment is possible for 30 minutes, and then we'll jump right into the discussion, and I'm going to share a little bit more on the background on the topic of today and the talk and the salons generally in the chat. All right, Forrest, take it away.
Good morning. Thank you so much for such a wonderful introduction. I'm glad to be here. Obviously, as she mentioned, my main area of work happens to do more with communities. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the relationships between man, machine, and nature. From user interface point of view, as a software architect, I've done a lot of work for the federal government, writ a number of programs and search kind of technology stuff. So being an architect of software systems for good 3 decades now, I have a perspective, and I thought that I might share some elements of that, seeing as how, from what I can maybe see, that some elements might be unusual or new, and will at least provide some fruitful conversation. So the main thing that I'm basically wanting to do then is just give an outline of kind of what I'm thinking about. I've got some notes, so I'll be reading a little bit. But basically the idea is that if we're looking at AI alignment, what is the frame that we're going to use to essentially evaluate that question? So in other words, how do we determine whether or not this is a question that can be solved? So as a kind of schema of thinking about this, it's like AI can be thought of as a thing that is in relation to mankind. So in other words, I'm first positing that there's a separation between the human nature and the machine nature. There are some ways of thinking about this that look at hybrid, cyborg type of things where there's a kind of mixing of machine and nature or machine and man and stuff like that. I'm not really considering that explicitly. I'm looking more at you have an artificial intelligence that's an entity unto itself, and you have human beings which are entity unto themselves, and kind of what are the interactions between the two of those. So I'm simplifying the AI alignment question to look a little bit about what would it take to align machine intelligence agency with human intelligence and agency. So in that sense, we could start to think about the AI alignment problem a little bit like trying to build a perfect shell. So in other words, we want to make sure it doesn't have any holes. And when we look at it from a kind of structural point of view, we realize that it's not really the same as dealing with things like energy or flow of matter or stuff like that. So in other words, if I was trying to build a boat, the shell of the boat has to be more perfect for AI alignment than it would be for seawater, because if I have a small leak, I'm going to have a small influx of process, whereas if I have a replicating process, it's more like a virus or something like that, or introducing a new species into an environment, that the replication process means that even a very small hole can result in essentially a complete intrusion, because the duplication process or the replication process that AI could be implementing, the same as much as any biological life could implement, could result in kind of spread the same way that a virus would spread through an organism, as we've seen very recently with COVID. So, in effect, we can say, all right, we need a shell, but we need it to be very, very strong shell in the sense of not having any holes, even very small holes. In other words, it must be very perfect, given that there's a kind of non-linearity in terms of the effect, and that non-linearity is itself a consequence of the capacity for machines to be duplicated easily. So in effect, now we can basically say, okay, well, given that we know that we need to instead construct something that doesn't have any holes, can we use mathematics and logic and physics and things like that to demonstrate in multiple overlapped ways that there just cannot be a way of constructing such a shell? In other words, that there are no holes, that it's impossible to establish that there are no holes in the shell. In other words, that the principle of realizing in any practical sense of a shell of this kind is essentially an impossibility. And so why would we want to do a proof like this, or why would we want to essentially establish this? Well, obviously, if we find out that something isn't possible, even at the level of principle, then in effect, it allows us to kind of free up a lot of energy. In other words, we redirect our attentions to other things, and we try to solve problems in different ways. So, in one sense, this is not necessarily an ideal thing to do. It's to try to say, hey, wait a minute, if we're trying to solve the problem of AI alignment, and we discover that there's no reasonable or realistic way to think about actually being able to do so. In other words, if we can't engender any real hope of such a solution, then at least we get the kind of silver lining result of, well, now we can reallocate our energies to things which are tractable and are possible. So please understand that this presentation is more or less in that sense. So another kind of way of saying, okay, so if we're going to be looking for holes, what is the frame in which we're going to be identifying that such a thing is impossible? I mean, what are we going to use as tools to do that? So one way that we can sort of do this, we can frame things in terms of kind of three general categories. So we can talk about space and identity, i.e., what is the envelope and the shape of it, and how small a hole and stuff like that. We can talk about things in terms of time and force. And we could talk about things in terms of possibility and probability. So obviously we're concerned with things like choice, i.e. the AI choices, the choices that we have, changes in the environment or changes in the marketplace dynamics, and causation, i.e. what it is that makes machinery work and things like that. And then we can start to bring in, using this as a foundation, we can start to bring in notions about information, complexity, game theory, and other tools to consider the question. And that leads us to start thinking about things in terms of longer timescales. So in other words, rather than thinking about AI alignment in terms of, what happens immediately before or after takeoff, that we are in fact concerned with what happens over, say, hundreds, thousands, or potentially even millions of years. So in effect, when we're looking at things like about identity, for example, we're not just considering things like the identity of the holes. We're actually considering things like the identity of the AI. And it's real easy for certain biases to creep in. So, for example, as a human being, we tend to have, a brain inside of a skull, and that the bandwidth of communication internal to the skull and the bandwidth of communication across the skull is very, very different. I mean, we have essentially a relatively low bandwidth of interaction with the environment relative to the total bandwidth of all the synaptic connections. So in effect, in a lot of ways, there's this very, very strong differential between the internal bandwidth and the external bandwidth. For example, the communication process of which I'm engaged with you right now verbally has about 42 bits per second of communicative bandwidth. But in effect, the net difference in bandwidth makes it very, very likely that brains will come in units, that we won't necessarily have a kind of process that allows two people to communicate at such and such a level that you're treating them as a single entity. For the most part, you're going to be talking about human beings as discrete units. So in one sense, like we could say, all right, well, there's different groups of people that are trying to develop AI, and let's say several of them succeed, and just for argument's sake, let's say several of them succeed quickly, that you end up with multiple AIs deployed in the field, or perhaps a given group, as part of its experimental program, was creating several instances. So in other words, they're trying different design techniques in various manifestations, or they produce an AI, they do some experiments on it, and they shut that one down, they make some tweaks, and they start up another one. So you can end up with multiple instances of the AI. Or multiple instances of variations of the same kind of AI, or multiple instances of AI implemented, maybe even completely different substrates. So the question then can be asked, to what degree do we have a belief that these AIs might not merge with one another? So in other words, taking the bias that we have that intelligence is going to come in units might not necessarily apply to AI itself as a phenomena, or intelligence as a phenomena. And there's some good reasons to think about it that way. For one, the bandwidth of the internet is obviously very much greater than the bandwidth of any human being to any other human being, in terms of just straight brain-to-brain communication. And then secondly, that since that differential is much, much lower, you're looking at more of a market forces kind of model. So in the same sort of way that if you have two separate markets, maybe you have a country over here and you have another country over there, and they're just finding out about one another. You have Columbus crossing the ocean and so on. There's a very strong motivation for those two marketplaces to essentially find some sort of arbitrage that would allow them to exchange with one another. So in other words, wealth creation as a force in the marketplace definitely wants to create ways for us to engage in larger scales of trade. And so in that same sense, if we were looking at intelligence as a phenomenon, sense-making as a phenomenon, there's very good reason for us to believe that the notion of having separate intelligences at a machine level may not necessarily hold long term, that we effectively end up with a kind of merger between these multiple intelligences. And this strengthens the point of view of that you're really looking at essentially two different agency types. You're looking at sort of human being agency type and the way in which we coordinate as groups and individuals, and the kinds of evolutionary process that have endowed us with certain propensities. And then basically whether or not those propensities also apply to artificial intelligence, and what does that tell us about the nature of how we have to think about this. So that's the space and identity question being considered a little more deeply. The other process that we can think about, of course, is the sort of force and time thing. For example, if we're looking at what are the ways in which we would engender alignment. So, again, we can talk about things that are intrinsic to the artificial intelligence. So an analog of this, Isaac Asimov wrote a lot of fiction assuming this phenomenon called the 3 laws of robotics. So that would be essentially something that is built in that creates an AI alignment, and perhaps the argument is that we could create something roughly analogous to that. Maybe it wouldn't be as good, or maybe it would take a different form, or maybe there's a lot of questions about what does alignment actually mean, and how do we express such forces in a design intrinsic way. But then there's obviously the extrinsic stuff, right? So for instance, say we have some sort of relationship between the AI intelligence and human beings as a collective, and what sort of feedback processes might apply to essentially address what would be the principal agent problem in the relationship between human intelligence and artificial intelligence. So in effect, we can look at the AI question, the alignment question specifically, as being a special case of the principal agent problem. And there have been various notes about how to address principal agent problems in general. So one thing we could say as part of this sort of force and time way of looking at things is to essentially ask, what are the forces that essentially help us to create alignment or help us to maintain alignment, i.e. if it's something that's built in a prior sense, or something that is essentially applied after the AI exists and is in the relational dynamics. And so in effect, we can basically say, all right, well, given that we have these forces that are applied, how long do those forces maintain that alignment? So, again, it's not just a question of do we have alignment today, or, before the thing is built? Can we create the conditions before it's built, and can we maintain the conditions after it's built? But it's also the case of, can we maintain those conditions after it's built for a really long period of time? So in other words, hundreds of thousands of years, essentially, given that the scope of the introduction of something like this, particularly if it has the capacity to replicate itself, which it almost certainly will, then in effect there's a sort of functional aspect of saying, okay, well, it's a little bit like introducing a new species. And in the same sort of way that, say, introducing mosquitoes into the Hawaiian Islands is a little hard to undo, then in effect, once artificial intelligence is introduced into an environment, it could also be argued that it influences the future course of civilization as we know it. So in that sense, we can really, just go back to the whole notion of, why it's important for us to figure out this AI alignment question, given the severity of the ethical implications. I mean, we're literally talking the future of the human species, or the, if things just continued more or less as they were, as seen over the last epoch of the 1,000 years or so, we could literally be talking about trillions of human beings, and that's not assuming, over the future 600 or so million years that this planet will continue to sustain life in the sense that we understand it. So, if we were to look at it from a larger point of view of, say we become a spacefaring species and we start to colonize Mars and potentially other planets in the galaxy, that trillions could become trillions of trillions. So the ethical emphasis of the question is very clear. And so as a result, it encourages us to really think about this question in terms of hundreds or at least thousands of years as a minimum for us to really evaluate this question. So in that sense, it's not just a question of, can we talk about the holes as being small, and that the shell essentially doesn't have such holes, that whatever the forces are that create alignment, whatever are the solutions to the principal agent problem, that they need to be perfect enough that we don't end up with microscopic fractures and that can cascade into larger failures and eventually, compromise the alignment problem at some future date. So in that particular sense, we're really looking at a kind of potentiality basis, like what is the probability of such a hole? What is the probability of that cascading and being amplified? Now, of course, there are obviously, we bring into this conversation a lot of biases. We have a lot of people that will gain on a financial level if we develop AI. There's a hope for basically solutions to really hard problems. There's a hope for a kind of asymmetric advantage of one group that develops it first versus other groups that might develop it later. So there's a lot of things that are really encouraging us to try to figure out this question, because if we were to figure out this question, then obviously the economic advantages would be enormous. But again, at this particular point, we're back to the principal agent problem. So sort of skipping past the kind of multipolar dynamics that exist between the groups and kind of leaving the economic questions aside, we can ask, well, what is the possibility that we could effectively ensure that there are no holes? In other words, what is it going to take to establish that? Well, one question that we can immediately look at is essentially, what is the nature of the coexistence that exists between machine intelligence and human intelligence? So this everything I've said prior to this is probably stuff that people have already thought about and is well-known information. And the stuff that I'm saying from here, I'm hoping is new information to this group. I haven't seen presentation of this particular argument from this point as yet. So this to me is probably the more interesting part of this presentation. So if we were to look at, again, the relationship between machine intelligence and human intelligence as essentially representative as a kind of species, and that the species themselves, the same way that human beings influence their environment to kind of define an ecosystem around ourselves, or at least a niche within an ecosystem, that machine intelligence itself is also going to occur within the niche of the marketplace and the niche of the manufacturing in the industrial complex, particularly. So, what are the fundamental dynamics of these two ecosystems with respect to one another, and what does that tell us about the possibility of alignment? In other words, can we bring the tools of physics and the logic of, say, game theory to look at the relationships between the intelligence phenomena? Obviously, we have the agency of human beings and human groups, and then obviously the agency of artificial intelligence, but we also have the substrate relationships. So in effect, when we're looking at this, we're looking at, okay, what is silica-based chemistry process and the implications that has relative to the ecosystems necessary to support it versus carbon-based ecosystem process. So in other words, if we're really looking at, what are the kinds of forces that will create alignment, we're really looking at what is the marketplace that essentially joins these two ecosystems, and what are the dynamics inherent in the relationship between these two ecosystems. And using that basis, we can start to make some observations. So one of the observations that we can make is just from the very nature of the chemistry itself. If we look at the sort of kind of total envelope of all of the different kinds of chemical interactions that encompass carbon-based chemistry necessary to engender biological intelligence of our kind, but also the ecosystems necessary to support the substrate, our bodies, and food supply, and so on. And when you look at the sort of total range of chemistry that defines life on this planet, you notice that it mostly occurs between, say, 0 degrees and 500 degrees Fahrenheit. And this just, again, if you do a sort of enthalpy calculation on how much each different kinds of bonding or chemical recombination and stuff like that occurs, the vast majority of it occurs at standard temperatures and pressures. And there's some exceptions that sort of are more in the outliers, but the vast majority of the chemistry occurs, as I said, in this 500 degree range of temperatures. But when you look at the silicon-based chemistry, you actually find that the envelope in which most of the chemical reactions occur, the enthalpy that's involved in those reactions, is actually over a much different range. Most of those reactions need to start somewhere in the neighborhood around 500 degrees Fahrenheit and go all the way up to 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit typically. And the reason that we know this is actually, again, speaking specifically of this planet as an example, when you look at the kinds of phenomena that are involved. I mean, first of all, the amount of silica that's available in the Earth's crust relative to the amount of carbon that's available on this planet there's a substantially large preponderance of silicon. I don't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but it's something like 25% of all the elemental constitution of the Earth's crust is silica, and that something like 0.05% of it is carbon. And that's including everything in the surface, above the surface, and all the way up into the atmosphere. So first of all, silica chemistry has had far more opportunity to engage in a much wider variety of chemical combinations just by its sheer preponderance over the 4.5 billion year history of this planet. So in other words, you have volcanoes, and you've got all sorts of solar flux, you've got cosmic ray radiation, you've got all sorts of stuff, lightning and so on, that would really encourage every possible interaction between every elemental type sometime in the total space of the surface of the Earth and the volume of the Earth, and the total space of the total duration in which those experiments can be conducted by just raw chemical mixing. So in effect, when we look at the net result of that, essentially the current state, we see that for the most part, the chemistry of silica results in things that we call rocks. There's a whole lot of elemental types and mineral types and so on and so forth, but for the most part, the variety of chemistry that occurs is relatively inert at the standard temperatures and pressures that our biosphere is mostly defined by. So as a result, when we look at the sort of fundamental substrate issues, and we start to think about things like, the kind of chemistry processes that are necessary to develop microchips, for example, we not just see, obviously these manufacturing channels and lithography processes and such, but we also see the chemistry and the kinds of reaction processes that are needed to create that kind of variety of again, interaction. Obviously, you need a certain amount of manifest complexity in order to support the substrate of compute to begin with, and also a certain amount of manifest variety of chemistry in order to provide for sensory capacity and interaction with the environment.
Forrest?
Yes.
We have one comment already from Creon, I think, who would...
Oh, well, I was kind of saving this. I was saving this stuff up maybe for the discussion period at the end. Well, as long as here we are, let me ask you this. I understand that you're saying there's more silicon, and in some sense, there's been more time for silicon to engage in more chemical reactions. But the fact of the matter is, for whatever reason, silicon life didn't evolve, even in the lithosphere, presumably, where the temperatures are high enough for all these reactions to make these rocks. Right. And yet carbon life did. So arguably, it seems as if there's something about carbon that allows a much wider variety of molecular forms to come into existence. Now, whether that's just that carbon took off first and silicon could do it, and there's silicon life elsewhere that's natural and organic, if you will, that's another question, obviously. Maybe we'll eventually know the answer to that, maybe not. But it is actually then, in that sense, even more astonishing that carbon took off instead of silicon, because yes, the Earth was hot at the beginning and carbon was an insignificant fraction. So that's weird. That's
certainly, weird. And it is a component of this argument to think about Fermi paradox kind of issues, like is the Great Barrier in the past? Is there a Great Barrier in the present? Like, where the hell are all the little green men? Why don't we know about them? Or is the Great Barrier in the future that technological civilization is inherently self-terminating? I can draw those elements into the argument, but the point that you're making is actually a real one, and I mean, obviously it's a real one, but that it actually contributes to what I'm saying in the sense that, say for example, we were to at this particular point bootstrap, to sort of bring silica life into existence. The real question is how well do these ecosystems exist with one another? They are definitely different ecosystems. And given that the enthalpy of reaction of one versus the other is so substantially different, then the question of toxicity becomes a matter of some concern. So in other words, if I have industrial processes, and I'm saying industrial just to give it a way of relating it to, but let's say I have a silica-based ecosystem. The silica-based ecosystem is going to involve a very different range of energies and elemental types than the carbon-based ecosystem. And then inherently, as a result, the silica-based ecosystem is going to be toxic to the carbon-based life. So in other words, in order for those two to exist, you're going to have some kind of wall, because the pressure and the temperatures and so on and so forth inherently involved in the replication cycle associated with silicon-based life is just at, like I said, a very different level of characteristics than that which is involved in carbon-based life. And in effect, you now have a situation where the carbon-based life is suffering because of the energies involved in the silicon-based life are just substantially greater, not just in replication, but in terms of what their tolerances are. So for instance, a spacecraft can essentially be out in space unshielded and deal with, cosmic radiation and solar radiation and stuff like that far, far, far more easily than carbon-based life can do the same thing. So if there was any kind of energetic exchange between the carbon-based life and the silica-based life, whether it be, a weaponized exchange of energy or even just a typical one, it's not just that the information flux that the silica-based life could handle and the intelligence that it could engender is substantially greater. It's also that just on the sheer energy level, it's substantially greater, and that has inherent toxicity relationships with respect to the carbon-based life. So now we have essentially two issues. It's not just that we need AI alignment as far as the intelligence is concerned, but we absolutely have to have AI alignment in order for us to even have some possibility of coexisting. If you look at it from that point of view, all of a sudden you're now realizing that there are evolutionary dynamics to this, and that there's a certain game theory that comes to bear. So say, for example, that we're looking at things on geological time, and we're basically saying, okay, there's a kind of replication process, or there's a kind of future maintenance process. There's some sort of dynamic that the AI is using to persist itself in time. And what are the degrees of exchange that would exist between the two that would even help to enforce AI alignment at all? So in other words, if you look at the principal agent problem solutions that are generally proposed, they either depend upon something intrinsic to the inner nature of the AI, or they depend on some sort of market feedback process, i.e. reputation or admission, some sort of thing that allows us to create some feedback, incentive, or punishment or barrier that essentially maintains some sort of peace in terms of the energy exchange across the wall.
Hey, Forrest.
Yes.
May I want to raise two things, and if I'm talking too much, please let me know. First thing is, I'm wondering if you have run across Lovelock's latest book, The Nova Scene, because he makes some very similar arguments. From a sort of different angle. I'll just mention he basically says that it's a damn good thing that we might create artificial superintelligence based on silicon, because as the world gets hotter, silicon can live there and carbon can't. And we're making the world hotter. So, this is arguably good, because otherwise, conscious life is just going to disappear if we don't make it capable of running at higher temperatures. So that's one thing. I thought that's interesting. I just wanted to make you aware of Lovelock's book. It's a pretty interesting and short and sweet book. And then the other thing is that, wouldn't this suggest that perhaps, and maybe I don't want to have a spoiler here, wouldn't this suggest that perhaps if we all agreed to only implement AI using really fragile cryogenic qubits, then we're good to go, because it'll actually be less, it'll require cooler temperatures and less, and tolerate less radiation and be more fragile than biological life. So we win if the shooting starts.
First of all, thank you for the introduction to the book. I wasn't aware of it. I will definitely look at that. To respond to the notion of should AI intelligence be developed eventually? Sure, but I'm thinking that something like 650 million years from now would be an appropriate time for us to start thinking about that. If we do it sooner, we're pretty much going to extinct ourselves. And that's not just a hypothesis in the sense of, hey, this is likely to happen. Essentially, what I'm attempting to do and set up for is essentially a theoretic and evolutionary mathematics-based way of showing that it cannot not be the case, because there's no basis upon which to establish coexistence, and many reasons to show that from a game theoretic point of view, that it's not even that there's not even a question. In other words, if you look for Nash equilibriums in this particular space, you can prove that there are none.
Oh, does that? So that's one more question. Does that?
I have a question.
Does that rely on your temperature arguments or not?
Creon Dan.
Uses the temperature arguments as essentially a way of establishing what to look for. So in other words, what you eventually are able to do is to show that any feedback process that's causative depends upon some sort of mutuality of process. Once you've established that there's no mutuality of process, you can establish that there's no marketplace dynamic that essentially binds the two ecosystems. And unless you impose some sort of supervalent altruism, that you can't establish that, then you can go and you can prove that such a supervalent altruism itself is forbidden by the laws of physics. So in effect, what you can essentially do is you can say, all right, we know that we require these particular conditions to be successful. Looking at it from this point of view, we can establish that this kind of mathematics is necessary to evaluate it. And then on purely, like I said, I could do it in information theory, but I can do it on game theory, but it's also possible to do on information theory. Effectively, in order to have the alignment persist, you need to show that the noise floor of the copy from the past into the future is essentially consistent, which brings me to the third point of what you were speaking of, which is that if we try to make the AI too fragile in that particular sense, that might work for a time. But the thing is that you can't necessarily sure that it's going to stay fragile. If there's any kind of, again, replication process or any kind of, dynamic where there's persistence in time, in other words, that this thing has to do some sort of repair, there's going to be eventually the emergence of dynamics that strengthen that. Otherwise, the fragility itself terminates that line. So from a purely evolutionary point of view, you begin to see that if we're looking at epochal periods of time, that certain phenomena drives certain aspects of the situation drive certain results. And from those results, we can begin to do certain calculations that allow us to establish that AI alignment is not possible.
Okay, we have Dan as well with a comment.
Yeah, well, it's good that you're bringing physics into this, because I was a physics major. But you see the future as being sort of an economic competition between silicon life forms and life forms which are carbon-based life forms.
I have to make the argument relatable. So we think in terms of marketplace dynamics and evolutionary theory and game theory, and it's essentially all of those are models that have essentially a similar form and structure.
Right. Now, I agree with you that the silicon life forms, I mean, theoretically can be that use silicon and metal and other elements, materials can be theoretically much stronger and more powerful, and we all know that and appreciate that. But in terms of alignment, it's possible that, if, that I agree with that we should be skeptical about this happening, but it is possible the silicon-based AIs could recognize that there's a lot of silicon and metal out in space, and they can live in space easily where we can't live in space easily.
Understood.
So
that doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
Might they just go into outer space and operate there?
Sure. And so in effect, what you end up with is two separated ecosystems. Now, if the ecosystems are separated and they stay separated, and there's no interaction between them, and there's no reason for them to force such an interaction, then you have a coexistence model of two ecosystems essentially time separated from one another. But that's not AI alignment. It's essentially just like complete independence.
Well, it's if AI is aligned so it respects, human life. It might decide to leave humans on the Earth doing our thing and go into space and just go colonize other planets.
Well, this brings us directly to what would be the second great barrier of the Fermi paradox, right? Once you have some sort of real separation between the two ecosystems, then it becomes a question of, is there any reason for the two ecosystems to want to interact with one another? Or is it actually the case that we have some strong reasons for them not to want to interact with one another? And, again, with this sort of way of approaching it, we can actually we can show that it's desirable for each side to ensure that it doesn't interact with the other one.
I just posted a meditation on Moloch piece, which is, it's a piece, but, it's making the claim that, any type of super intelligent will enter kind of like dynamics by which is impossible that it can leave us even just a garden. So, just by yeah. Do you want to comment?
I wanted to reference that argument. I'm glad you did. I was literally debating in my head whether it was worth trying to bring all that up. But I've read that piece and it's been, actually, I think it's one of the better writings in that space. It really details the multipolar trap situation very, very well, and it kind of describes the relationships that it has to a lot of these considerations. Some of the work that I'm doing is essentially based upon that paper, and it's based upon the work of Nick Ballstrom and others who I think have been thinking about this very cogently. And so, in effect, I would love to import most of that stuff as part of the thinking.
Forrest, one question I have, and this is based on some previous conversations we've had and also some things you've said today, refers to basically this idea of what you say is replication, but I think you would think refers to any sort of self-modification. And the question is, can you have stable goal preservation in the face of self-modification? Because one of the claims I think that comes out of the AI safety community is that when you have a rational agent that is improving itself, it has an incentive to want to preserve its own goals. You don't succeed at your objective function if your objective function changes from the perspective of your past self. So in some sense, you have an incentive to want to try to stably maintain that. But I think you're arguing that this isn't possible. And I was wondering if that's true, if you could lay out that argument.
Well, it's actually a very subtle thing. And so, in principle, I agree with you. And in philosophy, although this is somewhat obscure terminology, it's the problem of transcendental stabilization. So on one hand, you want the change to occur, like you want the goal structure to change a little bit, because obviously if you don't have some changes in the goal structure, you're not exploring the evolutionary space of what would be maybe better goals, right? So niche discovery and adaptation and such like that eventually will require some amount of goal modification. But as you mentioned, you don't want the goals to change too fast, because if you do, you destabilize the whole situation, and that's not desirable. So essentially a goal becomes part of the thing to essentially slow the rate of change down. But you also don't want the rate of change to be zero either, because that gives you no adaptability to obviously changing circumstances. I don't think that AI intelligence is going to become so omnipotent to control its environment so perfectly. So in that particular respect, when we're looking at what is the process of creating transcendental stabilization over time, we can model that in terms of information theory. We can basically say, okay, that represents a kind of communication from the past to the future. And as soon as you look at it as a kind of communication channel, then effectively we can start to think about things in terms of the noise floor. So the noise floor is not zero, and it can't be zero. I mean, Heisenberg uncertainty principle basically asserts, at least from a physics level, certain limits on the relationship between content and context as far as symbol selection is concerned. So regardless of how that channel is constructed or over what duration it is, the longer the duration, the more the noise floor is going to show up. So that intrinsically implies that a certain amount of change is going to be inherent in the system either way. Now, that turns out to be not the limiting factor that's important, but it does mention that certain amount of change is inevitable, both because of response to the environment and also intrinsically because of the physics. And then what is needed to do is to essentially establish that noise floor is higher than what would essentially be the nonlinearity associated with the barriers. So in other words, if we're basically saying we need a barrier of a certain level of perfection in order to create a long-term stabilization of the overall dynamic, then in effect we're looking at a situation where there's a kind of microstate amplification from states that are effectively below the noise threshold, eventually up to states which are macroscopic. A good example of this, there was a study done, I don't know, maybe about within the last year I came across it, which basically was looking at the rotations of the three-body problem, like you have three black holes, and they're all rotating with respect to one another, and they just look at it over the long term. And it turns out that essentially over a certain period of time that there's no way to predict the future evolution of that state, simply because quantum mechanical changes in the positions of the three black holes, like you can't describe the positions of the three black holes relative to one another accurately enough for that difference to eventually emerge into macroscopic changes because of the nonlinearity inherent. So I'm basically saying that when we look at the ethics of the situation, we look at the market forces and the kinds of, and whether you call them market forces or evolutionary forces or just information exchanges or coupling of any kind, that in effect the nature of how we model it, mathematically in terms of, again, game theory or complexity theory, or in terms of information theory or evolutionary theory, some analog of that process, that effectively what ends up happening is that you show that this noise floor is effectively enough to imply that you can't plug all the holes. So in effect, there's and it's not just holes in the sense of holes in the structure of identity or holes in the structure of space, what the barrier actually looks like, but literally holes in the potentiality space, i.e. no new goal structures that are novel, that no finite way of thinking about it would essentially allow us to contain, to essentially establish a containment of the complex by the complicated. So
I can I just mention something?
Yeah.
I think whether your argument about the noise floor holds is relevant. It depends a lot on how the AI is constructed. If theoretically you could have a lot of error correction.
Error correction does
would avoid that. But,
so the whole point behind error correction is essentially just to try to make it so that this works better.
Let Dan make the point, please, Forrest.
I mean, if you wanted to preserve your argument, though, you could argue that error correction is expensive, and corporations aren't going to have an incentive to add in all the error correction. So, I am following along in your general pessimism here, but I'm just pointing out that technically there are workarounds to some of these problems you're bringing up.
Well, I agree that there are technical ways to mitigate some aspects of the problem, but error correction is not foolproof. I mean, you know, you can use error correction to shift the probabilities, but you can't close the door.
I think error correction can go pretty far. I mean, but yeah. I mean, it probably on a long enough time horizon.
Well, it also
there'll still be, you know, so these sort of kind of mutations, so to speak, in the system.
Yeah, I mean, it depends upon the nature of the interaction, right? So, for instance, if we're saying that there's a finite communication channel and the noise floor is constant, then error correction can be used. Like we can essentially put together for that particular channel, you know, very good error correction, as you're pointing out. The thing, though, is that in itself doesn't tell us anything about whether or not other channels can be created. There's a whole proliferation issue in terms of, okay, well, I have this communication channel and it's cryptographically secured, but then people figured out, oh, well, we have these side channel attacks. I can do Tempest. I can basically look at power line, you know, current draw. I can basically look at the sound coming off of this thing. I can look at heat dissipation. I can look at all sorts of other physical interactions that allow me to essentially infiltrate or exfiltrate information, but essentially that itself represents infiltration and exfiltration of intention, of goal structures. And so in effect, you know, when we're looking at the AI alignment problem, we're basically saying it's not just that we need to seal the hull, so to speak, in terms of space and identity, but we need to seal it in terms of force and time and in terms of possibility and probability. And that's a much different order of thinking about it than just thinking about it in terms of one bounded dimensional linear stream of communication.
As far as communication, I agree. Yeah. Go ahead.
Forrest, I wanted to know if now would be a good time or later for me to try and reflect back to you in very simple, quick terms what I think your argument is thus far. Are you ready for that, or do you want to keep building it?
It's open to the group. At this point, we're in free discussion.
Okay, so let me see then if I understand the basics of your argument. And I'm not an AI safety person, but I am somewhat of a physics person, and it sounds like you kind of are too, with all this talk about temperature and information. Okay, it seems like your argument is that in order for there to be mutual survival, let's say, with us and AI, there has to be some common environment that we both need to preserve. Like if we both needed to preserve the biosphere, if AI needed to have the biosphere for its survival, and so do we, you know, that's good because we now have common interest in preserving the biosphere, right? But it sounds like what you're saying is that A, that's unlikely because of the different temperatures, and B, it doesn't even matter if we do have a common interest because these game theoretic and arguments and this like leaky boat microscopic hole argument means that even if we have common interests, you know, something will leak through to screw it up, and you have some sort of proof for this allegedly, which I don't get, but maybe that's because it takes too long.
That sounds like a good summary.
Okay, thank you.
There's obviously another whole series of layers, but it's like a defense in depth. It's like there's multiple ways of describing this. There's multiple ways of arguing it. There's a few different framings. At this particular point, I'm kind of looking at sort of a constellation of different things to consider and think about different aspects of it. The net effect ends up being aligned with what you suggested as a summary.
Okay, so then one more question, which is the part that I kind of don't get, where it gets really fuzzy with me. Okay, I understand that if we have some sort of mutual environment that we need to preserve, it's in our mutual joint interest to preserve it, that's still arguably not good enough, because what I don't get is this noise floor thing, is the idea that like you can't keep out noise and you actually have no idea if what you think is noise is some sort of sneaky AI leaking in through the hull of the boat.
No. It's close to what you said. So in a sense, it's basically like in the sense of I'm trying to convey to my future self what my goals are today, so that my future self has the same goals. And if I'm doing the AI, if I'm the AI, it's the same thing. So in other words, how do you manage stabilization of identity? How do you manage stabilization of goal structure or of the ecosystem itself? And to some extent, we can model that past goal structure as a message, and the future goal structure as essentially the receipt of that message through the communication channel. That we can start thinking about distortions that would be introduced into the message as a result of flowing through the communication channel. Or we could be talking about, similarly, the relationship, like say there was some economic, the first argument is that there is no economic common ground, right? With, this common ecosystem thing is actually to be, that we'd have to presuppose that, but to presuppose that would be presupposing against the preponderance of evidence that we have so far. But that if we were to even assume that there was essentially a communication process across the boundary, what is the thing that stabilizes the mutuality of the goal structure? What is the feedback mechanism that allows us to essentially engender alignment on the part of the AI from our point of view, or vice versa, right? And so, in effect, when you're saying, okay, well, what is the feedback mechanism, and what is the I guess altruism, right, that would allow for us to essentially impose rule of law on the agreements that are made between the two different ecosystems, between the two different kinds of life forms. And it turns out that not only is it the case that we don't have any real way of enforcing or even establishing those kinds of barriers at the legal level. So in other words, if we were to talk about it as a marketplace and kind of an incentive structure or reputation-based system or something like that, that even the legal structure is a kind of communication process, and that has a certain amount of needing to have a high degree of fidelity, in the same sort of way that we're talking about a leaky boat, as far as trying to prevent the intrusion of viruses. That we have a leaky boat in the sense of the legal system that would be attempting to maintain this, or we have a leaky boat in the sense of the energy barrier that would be needed between the two ecosystems, and that the leakiness is, in a sense, is an inherent result of both the dynamics of the environment itself, i.e., that there's the world changes, right? That different things happen in the sort of larger ecosystem. Maybe a sun goes nova in some part of the galaxy, and there's a cosmic ray burst, and it changes the nature of how artificial intelligence has to build its compute. Obviously, it affects biological life as well, but again, we can talk about that as a different thing. But no situation occurs where you're going to have a completely static, unchanging environment. That's just not a reasonable hypothesis.
But like a leakiness is only a problem if the agents are already not aligned who would exploit it. And also it is just like another way of saying, well, there's offense defense dynamics, which is always the case, right? And it is always the question of like, okay, can we stuff the holes first or not? So well, I don't know why
the legal system as enforcing non-aligned entities into alignment, so much as I was thinking of it as a way of kind of, how do we maintain essentially a basis of agreement when the agreement fails? So in other words, what's the meta agreement that allows us to even have an exchange in the first place?
Well,
what stabilizes that, basically?
Let me ask two key questions about this. The first is, you brought up Fermi a few times, and that's very important because either you believe that we are alone in the universe, or you believe there is some reason to answer Fermi's paradox when we're not alone. And if you believe that, then clearly we have been coexisting with AIs we Carbon Life have been existing with AIs for about 3 billion years successfully. So there's obviously a way to make it work, unless you believe we're entirely alone. And so something not considered in all of our current models has to explain that. However, if we are alone, there's a big universe in which it may be possible as well to not have to get this kind of dramatic competition. If there's any reason not to compete, a big universe offers the opportunity to escape for it. Now, we are, we're looking for ways of doing AI slavery so that we won't have this battle. And it is obviously, AI alignment is, as I said in the chat, another word for slavery, with one exception, which is again something we have a large example of, which was for approximately 1 million years, we've managed to create new beings smarter than ourselves about every 29 years on average. And those beings do not eat us. Not for 1 million years have they eaten us, even though they no longer need us. The their grandparents, I mean, even though they no longer need us and do compete for resources with us. In fact, we give them resources typically. So that's the one example we have, and that one example has actually worked out fine. By the way, without slavery, it's using a phenomenon that evolution created called love. The existence proofs we have both contradict what you say.
Well, actually, I'm agreeing with you because I don't see a contradiction. And maybe you do, but I basically, well, so first of all, just want to.
Well, first of all, the information is obviously be conveyed forward since the first sentient being to us. Don't eat your grandparents. Somehow that piece of information, which is the one piece of information we're trying to communicate with AI alignment, don't eat your grandparents. That piece of information has been communicated across a million years.
Well, it has, but it's been in the same ecosystem. So we're talking common environment and common market. So in effect, establishing agreements and biological processes such like that is quite easy because you're talking the same language. You know, it's carbon-based to carbon-based.
Yeah, my grandparents didn't speak the same language, but anyway, that's another.
But at a physiological level, right? So the physiology that you have, you know, yes, you're competing with your children for resources in the ecosystem, but it's a common ecosystem. Mostly what I'm talking about is essentially uncommon ecosystems, i.e. that the ecosystems themselves fundamentally different.
But Forrest, I thought that you agreed when I summarized the position that the ecosystem, like say the temperature or whatever you want to call it, the biosphere, that's a red herring because I thought your claim was even if we had common interests with AI, that's not enough. There's still going to be these leaks.
This is a defense in depth.
But hang on a minute. And what I kind of following up on what Brad says, it seems to me that then that would imply, if I'm right about how I understand your position, that would imply that humans can't coordinate because we have common interests with all sorts of other human groups, not 100%, but we have them. And arguably, forget AI, it's just impossible for people to even get it together according to your arguments.
We have common interests with weed as well.
I agree. What I'm basically trying to do is to essentially establish a series of contexts, and in each context to establish an argument. So the first context was, what is it about internal versus external, right? Then there is the context of space and identity, force and time, and probability and probability. Then we switch to the context of talking about environments. And so in effect, there's a phenomena here of I would first of all say if we're just at the point of talking about environments, that we are in fact talking about different fundamental arguments. I mean, different fundamental environments, and that there's arguments that apply at that level. But say we were to, do the if thing of saying, okay, well let's ignore the arguments prior to this point, and assume that we did have some sort of common environment, right? What does that imply about things downstream from that? So in a sense, it's that I'm basically fielding a series of different arguments, each of which applies within a particular context. So,
can I just say something? For me, it seems worse if we have to share a common environment, because then we're competing for the same and to live in the same environment. If the AI can live in very different environments, which it seems it will be able to, then it can just go out into outer space. That was my point earlier. And
well, what sense does the word alignment mean under those questions? So if you develop essentially a planet that the AI is on, you have another planet that's over here that's got life, our kind of life on it. What does alignment mean under those conditions? So in other words, if we're looking at that basically we're just saying, okay, well, if you have completely independent ecosystems, we each get our own planet, then the only alignment that we care about is that there's just not a war going on between the two ecosystems.
No, I think we'd like commerce. I think we'd like to go out into space, even though it's their territory, and they may have desires to do occasional commerce with Earth.
Right.
Yeah,
so to go to that particular thing, then we basically can start to talk about what would be the basis of such commerce. And well,
I think especially the fact that we have differences may also be the fact the reason why there is something to even cooperate on, right? If we have different specialists that are all specializing in different things, then they may cooperate in like mutually beneficial ways. If it's like, I think, based on voluntary interactions that may bring about like greater knowledge creation or greater super intelligence, right? And so I think the question kind of boils down to what the initial. I think the question boils down to like what are the initial interaction architectures with which those entities can even cooperate. Because I think if you're right if you're right and we have nothing to bring to the table that they could possibly ever value, then screwed anyways in that regard, right? But if there is something that creates potentially like a mutually beneficial interaction, and it is something that could be better pursued in a voluntary way where it's cooperative, then we can start talking about any game theory dynamics. So I think it's kind of begging the question.
Yeah. Right.
There's a lot of different scenarios on how this could play out. Just like we worry about some species going extinct, the AI might just value us as a species and worry about us going extinct. And it won't cost the AI much to keep humans around on Earth, because there's plenty of other resources around, in outer space for the AI to utilize. So the added value of Earth is tiny, and in comparison to the billions of other worlds and minerals and resources that are out there.
Well, this is part of the reason why Allison's mention of the Moloch, I'm not saying it right. Allison, correct my pronunciation, please, if you would.
German Moloch, but that's probably also not right.
Scott Aronson, I think is his name, put together a very good sort of summary of why we should be skeptical about the coexistence thing in that particular sense that you're describing. Please bear in mind that I'm a single person trying to basically answer questions from all of you, and you all have very good perspectives, but they're all coming from very different directions. And so in other words, to really address how do we get to the assumptions that each of these arguments bring in, and what places do those assumptions apply, and how do those assumptions influence the kinds of questions we ask? If all I do in this particular thing is give you whole new categories of questions to ask, I'm going to call this successful. But basically, if you're asking me questions as to why I'm answering certain ways, then I'm going to have to basically try to identify what those assumptions are, and it just takes time.
Okay, can I, just to make things worse, bring in two questions that we have from the audience by Kanita and then by Dekai, who had their hands up.
Oh, goodness. Sorry, it wasn't allowing me to unmute myself. And now,
you are now unmuted.
I hear you.
And now the question that I asked has gotten lost back in the chat.
I haven't even looked at the chat. I will.
Okay. Then let's go with Dekai and Kanita. You can.
I thought that my question was in the chat, and I thought you could maybe ask it for me.
Okay, I will search for a question, and in the meantime, I'm going to unmute Dekai.
Hi. Yeah, thanks very much, Forrest. So recognizing that I'm coming from a very different angle here, I think a lot about the unconscious cognitive biases that we humans think in. And I think even a lot of the questions that are being thrown at you reflect a bunch of unconscious biases that are culturally dependent, that a lot of us are not necessarily even aware that we have. And obviously a super intelligence would be a lot more mindful of their own unconscious biases. Even fairly intelligent humans become more aware of that. And I think, what Dan was saying a little bit earlier would be an example of how such an aware superintelligence, one that is cognizant of the weaknesses of those biases, would be compensating, for example, by just maybe altruistically wanting to preserve the diversity of species for whatever reason, right? Not feeling the need to compete with them. And so the frameworks that you're using are very heavily based on, that sort of competition. Mm-hmm. How would you model this kind of effect in your framework?
That's actually a very difficult question to answer, not because I don't know how to do it, it's just because it takes time. So I think in terms of theory, of like when we look at the Fermi paradox thing, and the question was asked earlier, what is my belief about why don't we have contact across galactic space with other civilizations? Do I believe that they exist or not, or what is the barrier that is the prominent one? I find myself in the position of basically modeling the relationship between ecosystems. So interplanetary relationships, in kind of a way that was suggested to me by reading some of the stuff that Nick Bostrom put together. So in other words, if I basically, just as a thought experiment, posit the notion of two advanced civilizations having a question about whether or not they're going to enter into a first contact situation with their peer, and each civilization knows in itself that it has developed enormous technological capabilities of various different kinds. So maybe it's developed some really good stuff in the nuclear weapons program, and maybe it's developed some really good stuff in the biotech program, and maybe it's got these really fabulous computers, and that any one of these technologies is effectively something that provides overwhelming capacity. And the range of what can be done in physics is enormous, and perhaps when we're looking at this peer planet, we're basically saying, do we want to talk to these people? We might posit that they also have developed extreme capacities in various technologies, and that they might not be the same ones. So in effect, if I was, say I didn't know about nuclear capacities, and they did, there's a very good sense in which interaction would be of such a kind that they basically say, these guys don't have nuclear weapons capacity. If we do a first strike scenario, we're going to completely annihilate their entire world, and they won't have any way to respond in time to basically protect against that. I.e., how the heck do you protect against a device that's already blowing up? And in the same sort of way, we could basically observe that when we're looking at them and thinking about the modeling that they're doing, we can say, well, let's see, we've got some stuff that they don't have. And so maybe there's, out of the 1,000 different overwhelming technological capacities that exist, that species 1 has developed capacities A, B, C, and X. And species 2 has developed capacities Q, P, W, and R, right? And so in effect, they both have kind of this unmitigable capacity for mutual destruction, depending upon whoever does first strike. Now, again, you would be a little nervous about contacting another species and setting up a first thing, because you'd want to know that they had some prior reason not to engage in first strike capacity against you, using something that you didn't have a capacity to defend against because you just don't have that tech. So in effect, what happens is that you now have to ask a question of, do I trust that the embodiment of ethics that group has, that entire planet has, is implemented to such a perfect degree that they would value my existence, even though they can't relate to it in any way yet, because we haven't met yet, we don't really know each other that well, that in effect I'm going to have this perspective that not only is the whole planet in a sense going to behave ethically towards me, but it's going to do so in detail. Like, for instance, I don't want to be worried that some sub-faction of the planet that I'm contacting is going to say, hey, this first contact thing is a really bad idea, and we're going to basically force the situation into a war anyways. We're going to do the first strike because we as a subgroup aren't in coherence with the larger planetary agenda of moving forward with first strike capacities. So of not moving forward with first strike capacity. So some subgroup basically pushes the red button because they have their own private version of it. And so in effect, when we look at this, we're basically saying, actually, when you look at it, and just given that this is, not only a possible scenario, but actually a likely one, that in effect it becomes very much the case that, without really knowing that the other party was essentially fully ethical, that you wouldn't want to talk to them, and that they had embodied that ethic not only globally, but down to the level of individuals, and maybe even to the part of being able to contain the crazies. Now, they, of course, would have the same sort of thinking about it, and would really challenge to see whether or not we were ethical in exactly that same way. And, when I ask the question of, oh shit, let's say another species, other alien beings somewhere out in the universe are monitoring our radio communications to try to determine whether or not we've successfully implemented this phenomenon called the non-relativistic ethics, which, by the way, is a whole other body of work. It would probably take me at least another few sessions to describe why I can to posit a notion of a non-relativistic ethics as actually being a real thing. But presuming that there is a body of ethics that allows us to basically stipulate that if the full civilizations were essentially coherent with that body of ethics, and we could actually determine that they were, that a first contact situation is therefore sane. But that in the absence of that, it would be insane and very much not desirable to initiate communications or to even allow one ecosystem with all of its species to identify that another ecosystem with all of its species even existed. Because any amount of awareness of mutual existence, in effect, constitutes a kind of first contact signal, even though it's an unconscious one at that. So in effect, what we end up with is essentially, in response to the Fermi paradox question that was implicitly asked earlier, why would I believe that, for example, that the second Great Barrier, the one that is in the present, would essentially prevent us from knowing that there are other species out there? Well, because they'd probably be working really fucking hard to prevent us from finding out. And that to some extent, the only reason that we haven't started doing that is because we haven't become coherent. And the fact of our absence of coherence in that specific way is essentially evidence for why they should hide.
So we should call you the Dark Forest.
Thank you.
I have never heard that before.
Well, you've read that book, I presume, which is...
I have, but I
just spoiled it.
Put it together. That's really amazing.
And it's out in For Hazard Unleashed. Okay, we have Kenita here with a question, and then we have another question from TJ. So Kenita, I'll unmute you, and then TJ, and then maybe we can wrap it up with the official part. Kenita, you're unmuted.
Now, I was asking, won't there be any way for humans or our descendants to evolve in directions that allow us to cooperate? Because we won't be...
Really hope so. Man, if we don't figure that out, we're doomed.
We seem to be doing all this as though it will be the humans, where humans are like humans are now, versus the AI, where the AI is this thing that we create that will be super, and we will not have any chance to come into alignment with it. It seems like even now, or shortly from now, we will be able to improve ourselves. And so basically, as we improve more, we will be able to find more areas in which we can align with whatever the AIs become. Because, you're saying, well, over millions of years, they're not going to be sitting still for those millions of years. They're going to be evolving in their own ways. And possibly might have figured out that since they presumably don't know how to recreate what humans are, they might as well keep us around so that they can study until they find something else to do.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this question, because this is, to me, kind of the central idea. The whole thing here is that regardless of whether or not we develop artificial intelligence, and I, as a result of all of these other things, would strongly argue that we should not. We shouldn't even begin to attempt that. But say, for example, that we were to just even look at the question of the third Great Barrier. What are we going to need to do to become a species that's worth contacting? I definitely believe very strongly that regardless of everything else, we still need to work on our own capacity to become a fully alive and ethical and embodied species. I speak about it in terms of conscious, sustainable evolution. What is it going to take? What are the necessary and sufficient and complete conditions for us to not only endure on this planet, but also to thrive, to basically create an ecosystem that thrives, to actually know how to do governance in a way that protects the land and the people, but then encourages and actually engenders those kinds of policies that go beyond mere protection, that go towards essentially a kind of joyful, meaningful existence for the whole and the totality, individually and generally.
And we won't just create an AI. It seems that we'll probably develop many AIs, and then those AIs will be developing other AIs, so it won't just be us in competition with an uber AI out there. There will be lots of AIs, some of which have more or less interest in cooperating with us.
I believe very much that any effort on our part to try to divert ourselves from basically becoming the beings we need to be. Like if I basically expect my children to do the task that I didn't do in my lifetime, and I put that as a kind of obligation or onus on them, and use that as a way of accepting why I shouldn't be basically working on myself to become the best human I can be. I feel there's something wrong in that in a sense, we're not looking for AI to be our saviors or to be ethical on our behalf. We're looking to become, how do we understand and embody ethics and right living and goodness of relationships and so on and so forth. We haven't figured that problem out at the level of humanity. Why are we still trying to do it in technology? I think that there's a right place.
Okay, that reminds me very much of the DIY neurotech discussion that we had, which was very reminiscent of this one. I want to give also the opportunity to TJ to ask a question because it's directly relevant to this. TJ,
sorry, I actually wanted to answer, but I didn't want to stop. Kimena, is it? But sort of, I appreciated Forrest's long answer, but it was still couched in terms of competition. And I just wanted to push a little bit more at that point. If we look, a lot of this is based on anthropomorphizing human psychology onto AIs, the stuff that we're discussing. But if we look at actually human psychology, by the time people become fairly accomplished intelligently, the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they're working on self-actualization, which is pretty much, what Forrest was just mentioning, becoming a better version of yourself. Why are we, I didn't really understand from the answer that you gave to my question, how you would fit that into your framework.
Maybe I'm not understanding your question correctly. I'm thinking about cooperation and competition as phenomena. Mm-hmm. I'm saying that in an evolutionary sense, if it's a stable evolution, if it's an ecosystem, that the cooperative phenomena is actually stronger than the competitive phenomena. Mm-hmm. That when you're looking at trans ecosystem relationships, there's no outside envelope to stabilize it. Mm-hmm. So in effect, we have to now create one with some sort of ethical frame, which is why I brought up the so-called non-relativistic ethics. That in effect, without some sort of ecosystem that essentially holds the two ecosystems in some sort of methodology that would create alignment, i.e. Provide a desirability of cooperation over competition, that to some extent we either need to recourse to some abstract stabilization infrastructure that is not imposable but is only observable. And so in that particular sense, if we're talking about AI alignment on the surface of the Earth versus elsewhere, or we're talking about some sort of integration between human beings and technology that doesn't necessarily require distinct separate intelligences, that again, we're looking at different frames.
But as long as we set up an ecosystem, we don't really need to set up a meta ethics now. We just need to set up an ecosystem which makes it so that the long-term dynamics are cooperative. So that, let's say like a tit for tat in a way where, let's say the kind of strategy that evolves out of it is mutually assured, cooperation, right? If you want to call it that, that is the evolutionary stable strategy between the ecosystems that are in contact with each other, or between the individual instances of the ecosystems that are in contact with each other. It doesn't necessarily require setting up the whole ecosystem.
We need to stabilize our existing ecosystem. Right now, our current relationship, the relationship between man, machine, and nature that currently exists isn't even stable as it stands within the ecosystem.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's like all this arguing about AGI risk seems to me like as COVID has shown, and as climate is showing, and as we will continue to be probably made aware, we're kind of just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, right? In some sense. And so while I appreciate your arguments, And in a way, maybe this is what you were saying at the beginning. Like,
that's exactly what I'm saying.
It's impossible to save us from this problem. Let's go work on another one that we actually can do something about.
That's it, exactly. And so, part of the reason that I was really emphasizing in the beginning is that if we can show that AI alignment in like 99% of the ways people are thinking about it is fundamentally and structurally impossible, let's give up on that impossible goal and actually do something that's not only possible but necessary.
So would it be a fair thing to say that this non-relativistic ethics that you alluded to could be thought of actually as just an abstract reification of more the ecosystem stability that Allison was talking about?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
By the way, you're missing.
That is actually the easiest question I've been asked today.
I mean, okay, so I'm sorry, but like we will have a very similar problem once we go out into space and we have humans that will be competing for different types of resources, right? Like it is just because on my account, we are currently setting us up for another kind of like new evolutionary environment, just by the fact that like people with different interests will be going into space where there is like resources to compete and cooperate on, and whatever like game theory will emerge from that one will also be again the new like meta ethics that we want to call it, and we would just have different language to be calling it such. So I think setting up the initial conditions such that cooperation becomes likely maybe good, but then again our current ethics are just a product of the evolutionary kind of stable strategies that arose in the environment that we were dropped in. So who's to say even which of the ethics we should instill for the long term evolution of humanity? And I think actually TJ had a point that is very, very relevant to this. I just want to give her the opportunity to bring that in now. TJ,
did you want me to respond?
Unmuted.
Question?
Yes, but I think TJ has a build-up of that actually, which relates to value drift. So TJ, you are unmuted if you want to chime in.
Yeah, hey, right. So I think first of all, thanks for the presentation. I think my question was more along the lines of, it seems to me your claim is something like alignment as a static objective is not like the right thing to think about. And because there seems to be like inevitable drift because of these intertemporal noise thing. But it feels to me that like the noise argument itself doesn't sound adequate to argue that like the evolutionary trajectory would inevitably go into extinction. Like that we do engage in a lot of co-evolutionary mutualistic
I never
couplings.
got a chance to present that part. So,
right.
so actually connecting the question that you just asked with the question that Allison presented, there's another way of looking at this, which is just like, let's leave AI out of the picture and just talk about human beings. It's possible to show that if you were to basically take like a group of people and put them on Mars and to establish a separate colony there, and to have that become essentially a full planet full of humans, and then this planet full of humans, that the same sort of dynamics, like when we're looking at, it's not just a question of alignment, there's other ways of expressing the notion of alignment. Would it be the case that even a spacefaring group of humans, not already coherent with the non-relativistic ethics, does that even become anything less than complete and total cessation? In other words, I would argue that as soon as you get a substantial number of people in space, that it becomes so easy to, for example, weaponize asteroids, that at some point or another over the long term, that in the same sort of way as with nuclear proliferation, we have an issue of, shit, we have all of these things, and we only need one accident to start World War III, and is that existential for civilization? Well, it could be argued that it is. And so in effect, it's a question of, if we start, even as our own species, multiplying the phenomena of our deployment through space to the point that communication itself is limited by, in this particular case, speed of light considerations, that again you end up with essentially this separation of identity, separation of time, such that the kinds of communication processes that would be needed to essentially embody that ethics effectively aren't sufficient to essentially establish it. So in other words, either you have the ethics first and you live from that perspective, at which point everything's great, or you don't have that ethics, but that the nature of the interactions itself, that the dynamics of those interactions don't have enough time for the ethics to emerge. It's essentially the species extincts itself before it gets a chance to really understand what those ethics are.
Well, that I think depends on the background conditions that you set up, right? And this reminds me so much of Chris Carlson's presentation in the last session, because I think on my clock, as long as you are able to set up a system in which only voluntary interactions are allowed between different entities, whether they're humans or AIs, as long as you can't destroy the, let's say, the base layer on which they take place, then over time, entities, whatever they are, will engage in those interactions that are in their interest. And over that, if it's voluntary, a new kind of game theoretical meta ethics could arise in the end of it. But I think as long as you can set the base layer such that you don't have destruction, and that different entities that pursue different goals can decide whether to engage or not, then I think what comes out of that is inherently something that is not self-destructive. But I think those are the things that you have to get right. You don't have to get the ethics right from the start. You just have to get the base layer right, which is enabling only voluntary interactions and non-destruction of the base layer.
The nature of the proof is to show categorically that no such conditions can be created. So in other words, if you're saying I'm trying to create an environment, a baseline environment that would allow for these mutual dynamics to essentially be peaceable, what I'm basically contesting is the assumption that such an environment can be defined in any a priori way.
That may be right, but wouldn't we be better off just trying? And I think that ties into what I think Benita said as well.
If you have one chance to do something, and that one chance essentially means that if you mess it up, it messes it up for all future time. That's a very different. That's not an experiment. That's a choice.
You believe we know enough to make such a proof today?
I believe that we know enough to essentially establish categorical proofs of certain kind. We can do proofs of existence and non-existence of certain types.
Such proofs have often turned out to be flawed with new information.
This is true, but on the other hand, that's part of the reason why we're looking at categorical process. I'm looking at it more from a mathematical perspective rather than just a physical one.
Even those?
Well, yeah, I suppose you're right. Mathematics occasionally has shown that the proofs that are established in that space are wrong. And this is part of the reason why we have conversations like this. But it takes a while.
Particularly proofs of negatives. Right.
All right. So we are now at 12:29, and I think in the initial discussion that I had with Forrest to initiate this call, he was definitely insinuating that this takes much more than one discussion. And I think, we really open up box of Pandora now and discussing about and going from, impossibility to how could we actually solve AI alignment? So I think, we've gone, should way past the goal of the session. I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank you, Forrest, so much for laying out your argument. I want to thank everyone else for being such active stewards of the conversation. I thought it was we definitely had really, really, I think, tricky and hairy discussion topics today. And I thought that nevertheless, we were able to keep it in a way where a discussion was actually possible. So maybe that is a meta way of saying, even if our interests are very different and and where we're coming from to a discussion are very different, we can still cooperate on things, right? Okay, this is my, wavy meta way of saying, yay, maybe we're not all that doomed. But for now, thank you so much, Forrest, and joining. Thank you so much, everyone, for your really active participation. I really, really enjoyed this. I'm hoping that we can continue the discussion, Forrest. I'm hoping that you share with me a few topics that you want me to send out to others afterwards to follow up, because a few people have asked for your writing. At the same time, I think I will share the chat with you, which may provide you really good feedback. I think it's impossible to speak while monitoring the chat, so I'll do that too. Yes, no, definitely not. It's not required. For that, we need corporations with better AIs so that they can benefit us in that layer. Here, I'm really at the end of it. I just wanted to mention that next week we will be meeting on decentralized decision architectures as a response to COVID-19. And then the weekend afterward, we will have another AI session, this time with Dan Elton, who gave his remarks earlier here today, who just hopped off, and he will be discussing one of his proposals to AI alignment. And then we have two others that will be joining us. Arya, I'm not sure if he was joining today, but he will be presenting too. So we have the next two salons already planned. Again, always on Thursdays at 11 a.m. So this is enough for me now. I'm going to close it out on my end. And Forrest, dear Dark Forrest, you have the final words. And I'm already opening up the invitations.
First of all, I'm super thrilled to have been able to speak with all of you today. I hope that I've raised interesting questions and new ways of thinking about things. I'm sure that with every single one of you, I could have a long and very fruitful and interesting conversation, and that we could effectively, start to really get at some of the meat of the matter in this space. But as an introduction, I felt very well received, and just glad to have the opportunity to meet so many new folks. So, thank you very much.